The room was cold with power and silence. A single Arabic sentence cut through the air, sharp, mocking, cruel. Some men smirked. Others stared at the table, afraid to look up. At the head of the room, billionaire Maid remained still, his face unreadable. Near the wall, a woman on her knees froze mid-motion, her mop dripping onto the polished floor. Slowly, she lifted her head. Then she spoke. Her Arabic was flawless, calm, precise, deadly. Every breath in the room stopped, eyes widened, smiles vanished. No one expected the maid to understand, no one expected her to answer, and no one was ready for what that single moment was about to destroy. Before we begin this story, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if stories about justice, dignity, and karma move you, subscribe and stay with us. Maid did not look like a man who needed to raise his voice. He sat at the head of the long conference table as he always did. Back straight, hands loosely folded, eyes calm but distant. The glass walls of the top-floor boardroom reflected the city below, towers of steel, endless traffic, the restless energy of a West African capital that never slept. This building, this empire carried his name in silence. He did not need to remind anyone who owned it. Everyone already knew. Maid was one of the most powerful businessmen in the region. Energy, logistics, infrastructure, ports, roads, power plants. His companies stretched across borders, languages, and currencies. But unlike other billionaires, he did not dress loudly or speak often. He avoided interviews. He avoided praise. He avoided confrontation unless it was necessary. People feared him not because he shouted, but because when he finally spoke, lives changed. Those who worked closely with him knew one thing. Maid observed everything. He noticed who arrived early and who arrived late, who spoke with respect and who spoke only to impress, who treated cleaners like furniture and who said good morning without expecting applause. He remembered faces, he remembered tones, and he never corrected people immediately. He let them reveal themselves. That morning's meeting was supposed to be routine, a review of a regional expansion project, numbers, deadlines, risks, nothing dramatic. At least that was what most of the executives believed as they filed into the room, adjusting their suits, rehearsing their confident expressions. Among them was Karim Diallo. Karim walked with the ease of a man who believed the room belonged to him. Late 30s, sharp haircut, expensive watch he liked to place deliberately on the table so it caught the light. He was one of the youngest directors to rise so quickly in the company, and he never let anyone forget it. To Karim, success was proof of superiority. He took his seat 2 chairs away from Maid, nodded politely, then leaned back, already bored. He had prepared his presentation, but more importantly, he had prepared his performance. He liked meetings. They gave him an audience. What Karim didn't like was silence, unless it was silence created by fear. Around the edges of the room, assistants stood quietly, tablets in hand. Near the door, a security guard kept his eyes forward. And along the far wall, moving slowly and carefully, was a woman no one paid attention to. Her name was Bintu Sanogo. Most people in the building knew her only as the maid or the cleaner. She wore a simple uniform gray dress, sleeves rolled just enough to work, headscarf neatly tied. She moved with practiced quiet, careful not to interrupt conversations or draw attention. Her eyes stayed low. Her steps were soft. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a form of protection. Bintu had been cleaning this floor for nearly a year. Every morning before sunrise, every evening, long after the executives had left. She knew which chairs were always pushed back carelessly. She knew which men spilled coffee and never apologized. She knew which corners of the room were never used and therefore never noticed. She also knew which voices carried contempt. As she wiped the marble floor near the window, she heard Karim's voice rise, slightly confident and smooth. He was speaking English, explaining projections, pointing at charts. Everyone nodded. Maid listened without interrupting his gaze, steady, his expression unreadable. Then Karim smiled. It was a small smile, the kind meant for himself. He leaned closer to the man beside him and murmured something in Arabic low enough that he thought only one person would hear. A joke, sharp, disrespectful. A few restrained chuckles followed. Quiet, careful, shared only among those who believed they were safe. Bintu's hand paused on the mop. Her fingers tightened around the handle, not because she was surprised, but because she understood every word. She did not look up. Not yet. Karim continued speaking, switching back to English as if nothing had happened. He glanced briefly at Maid, assessing him the way one assesses an old machine, useful but outdated. In Kareem's mind, the man at the head of the table was powerful, yes, but limited, old school, unaware. What Kareem didn't know was that Suleiman had spent nearly 10 years of his life in the Middle East. He had negotiated contracts in Arabic, prayed in Arabic, been betrayed in Arabic, saved in Arabic. Suleiman understood far more than Kareem could imagine, but he said nothing. Silence was not weakness to Suleiman, it was strategy. As the meeting progressed, Bintu continued working along the wall, her movements slow and deliberate. Her face remained calm, but inside her chest, something old stirred. Something heavy. Something familiar. She had heard this tone before, years ago in offices far from this city, in boardrooms with glass walls and men who spoke freely when they believed no one important was listening. Men who switched languages to hide cruelty. Men who thought intelligence belonged only to titles and suits. Back then she had worn heels instead of flat shoes, a blazer instead of a uniform. She had been invited to the table, not ignored beside it. Life had changed since then. Now she was here, quiet, invisible, listening. Across the room, Suleiman glanced briefly toward the wall, not directly at Bintu, but past her. His eyes flickered just for a moment, as if he had sensed something shift. Then he returned his attention to Kareem, who was finishing his point with dramatic confidence. "Any questions?" Kareem asked, his voice smooth. The room remained silent. Suleiman nodded once. "Continue," he said calmly. Kareem smiled, satisfied. He took the silence as approval. He didn't see the tension tightening beneath the surface of the room, nor did he notice that the maid by the wall had stopped cleaning altogether. Bintu stood still, mop resting against the floor. Her breathing was steady. The meeting was moving forward, but something irreversible had already begun. Because words spoken in arrogance have a way of circling back. And in this room where power, pride, and silence sat at the same table, no one yet realized that the most dangerous listener was the one they had chosen not to see. Kareem Diallo had always believed that intelligence was something you could display like a watch, or a tailored suit, or a foreign language spoken just loudly enough to be admired. To him, success was proof that he stood above others, and the higher he climbed, the less carefully he watched his words. The days following the meeting passed quickly, but the atmosphere inside the company began to shift in subtle ways. Kareem grew bolder, he spoke more, laughed louder, corrected people publicly. He enjoyed reminding others of his importance, especially in front of Suleiman Tour, whose calm presence only fueled Kareem's desire to stand out. In his mind, silence from the boss meant permission. Kareem did not know that Suleiman's silence was never accidental. During another executive briefing, Kareem leaned back in his chair as a junior manager struggled through a financial explanation. The young man's hands shook slightly as he spoke. He stumbled over a number, corrected himself, and apologized. Kareem sighed dramatically. Then, switching smoothly into Arabic, he muttered, "If incompetence were currency, this place would be richer than oil." A few men nearby snorted quickly, covering their mouths. The junior manager did not understand the words, but he felt the laughter. His face flushed. He lowered his eyes and rushed through the rest of his presentation. At the head of the table, Suleiman did not react. He wrote something in his notebook, his pen moving slowly, deliberately. Along the wall, Bintu Sanogo was dusting the shelves beneath the glass panels. Her movements remained steady, but her shoulders stiffened. She understood the sentence perfectly. Every cruel syllable, every careless assumption behind it. She said nothing. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she had learned what speaking too soon could cost. Kareem noticed her only briefly, and only as an object in the room. He watched her for half a second, then dismissed her entirely. To him, she was background noise. Someone paid to clean, not to think, certainly not to understand Arabic. That belief made him comfortable, too comfortable. As weeks passed, Kareem's behavior became a pattern. Whenever discussions grew tense, he slipped into Arabic to release his frustration, sometimes mocking Suleiman's age, sometimes belittling other executives, sometimes making comments that crossed the line from arrogance into outright contempt. Each time, Suleiman listened. Each time, Bintu heard everything. And each time, something inside her tightened. She had not planned to stay in this job for long. It was meant to be temporary, just enough to pay rent, just enough to survive quietly. But life rarely followed plans, especially not for people who had already lost so much. There were moments late at night when Bintu replayed Kareem's words in her mind as she cleaned empty offices. Moments when she remembered who she used to be. Moments when the silence felt heavier than the insults. One evening as she wiped fingerprints from the conference table long after everyone had gone home, Ibrahim Kone, the CEO's assistant, paused near the door. "You work very quietly," he said casually. Binto nodded, keeping her eyes on the table. "Thank you, sir." Ibrahim studied her for a moment. He was observant in his own way, trained by years beside Suleiman. There was something about Binto, something composed, something restrained that did not match the role she played. "You've been here a while," he said. "You like it?" Bintu hesitated. "It's honest work." Ibrahim nodded, accepting the answer. He turned to leave, then stopped. "Some people forget who is listening," he added almost to himself. Bintu's hand froze for just a second. "Yes," she said softly, "they do." The next board meeting arrived with a sense of anticipation. A major partnership was on the line, one that could shift the company's influence across borders. Tension filled the room before anyone spoke. Karim arrived early, unusually energized. He adjusted his tie twice, smiling at his reflection in the glass. Today he planned to impress. Today he planned to assert himself. Suleiman entered last as always, acknowledging no one with more than a nod. The room fell silent. As discussions began, Karim took the lead. His voice was smooth, confident. He spoke of strategy, of growth, of vision. Heads nodded, pens scribbled notes. Everything unfolded according to his expectations. Then, when a question came from one of the board members challenging his projections, Karim felt irritation rise. He leaned back, turned slightly, and spoke in Arabic again. Louder this time, sharper. "They ask questions because they lack the mind to see what's obvious," he said. And the old man at the head of the table still pretends he understands everything. The words hung in the air, heavier than before. A few people shifted uncomfortably. One man coughed. Another looked down at his phone. No one laughed this time. Near the wall, Binto was mopping slowly, methodically. Her head remained lowered, but her heart pounded in her chest. The insult was no longer indirect. It was deliberate, open. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her silence. Suleiman paused his note-taking. He lifted his eyes, not in anger, not in surprise, but in quiet recognition. He had heard this tone before, many years ago, in another country, in another life. He said nothing. Karim mistook that silence for weakness. The meeting continued, but the air had changed. It was no longer just about business. It was about character, about respect, about lines crossed without permission. Binto finished cleaning the section she was working on and stood still, her mop resting against the floor. She stared at the reflection of the table in the polished marble, the men in suits, the power they wielded, the blindness they shared. She felt something settle inside her. A decision did not yet form into words, but it began to take shape. Because silence, she knew, was powerful. But there came a moment when silence stopped protecting you and started erasing you instead. And that moment was getting closer. By the time the fourth meeting that month ended, the pattern was no longer subtle. It was visible, audible, familiar. Karim Diallo had grown comfortable with his own cruelty. He no longer waited for moments of frustration to slip into Arabic. He used it deliberately now, like a private weapon, sharp, precise, and hidden behind the false safety of assumption. Assumption that language created walls. Assumption that intelligence wore suits. Assumption that power could not hear from below. That afternoon, as executives gathered their documents and rose from their seats, Karim spoke again, soft but clear enough for those closest to him. In any serious company, he said in Arabic, cleaners would clean and thinkers would think. Here we pretend everyone matters. The words slid out of his mouth easily. Practiced, effortless. A man near him shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Another forced a polite smile. No one corrected him. No one challenged him. And once again, the silence did the damage. Binto Sanogo stood near the corner, wiping the base of the glass wall. She heard every word. Her hand slowed. Her chest tightened, not in surprise, not even in anger, but in a quiet, aching recognition. She had heard those words before. Not those exact words, but that same belief. She remembered offices where she had once been invited to sit, conference rooms where she had translated contracts worth millions, places where her voice had carried weight until it didn't, until a mistake not of skill but of circumstance had pushed her out of sight. Now, here she was again on the other side of the glass. Karim rose from his chair satisfied. He glanced briefly toward the wall, his eyes passing over Binto without stopping, as if she were part of the furniture. His expression held no malice toward her personally. That was the cruelest part. To him, she did not exist enough to be hated. She finished cleaning and stepped aside, her posture, composed, her face unreadable. Years of discipline had taught her how to hold herself when words cut deep, how to swallow humiliation without letting it spill onto her expression. But humiliation had a way of sinking into the body. That evening, long after the building had emptied, Bintu returned to the conference room alone. The lights were dimmed. The city outside glowed in distant lines of yellow and white. She moved quietly, wiping the long table, erasing fingerprints, straightening chairs. With every pass of the cloth, memories rose, uninvited. She remembered the first time she had been mocked in Arabic. It had been in Dubai years ago, and she was still new, still hopeful. She had corrected a senior executive's translation politely, professionally. He had laughed and said in Arabic, "Don't forget where you came from." She remembered smiling through it. She remembered not correcting him again. Now, as she worked, Kareem's words echoed in her mind, not as sound but as weight, a familiar burden settling where old scars already lay. She stopped at the head of the table. This was where Suleiman Tour sat. She had never spoken to him beyond a polite greeting, never looked at him for more than a second. Yet she had watched him closely, the way one watches the weather, carefully, instinctively. Suleiman never laughed at Kareem's jokes, never joined the quiet chuckles, never looked away when Arabic was spoken. He simply listened. That alone had kept Bintu steady. The next morning, Kareem arrived late, irritated before the meeting even began. Traffic, a missed call, a minor inconvenience, but to a man like him, inconvenience felt like disrespect. As soon as discussion started, he interrupted others freely. He corrected figures aggressively. He rolled his eyes when someone hesitated. Then when a junior analyst hesitated again, Kareem leaned forward and spoke, this time louder than before. In Arabic, he said with a smirk, "Confidence is wasted on people who clean floors." The room went still. This time no one laughed. Someone inhaled sharply. Someone else looked towards Suleiman, waiting for a reaction. The insult was no longer ambiguous. It was deliberate, and it was loud enough to reach the far wall. Bintu felt it like a physical blow. Her back stiffened. Her breath caught, not in fear, but in something closer to grief. The kind of grief that came from realizing how small others were willing to make you. She didn't look up. She finished wiping the floor and stepped back, placing the mop carefully against the wall. Her hands were steady, but inside her chest something shifted. Not anger, resolve. Kareem glanced toward her again, his lips curling slightly. Not in apology, not even in satisfaction, just acknowledgement, brief, careless, dismissive. Suleiman finally lifted his head. His eyes moved slowly around the room, resting on each face in turn. When they reached Kareem, they paused, not long enough to alarm him, but long enough to register. Then Suleiman spoke, his voice calm. "Let us proceed." That was all. Kareem leaned back, convinced he had won again. What he did not understand was that Suleiman was not allowing disrespect. He was collecting it. Later that day, Ibrahim Kone approached Bintu near the supply room. His tone was neutral, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were sharp. "You hear many things," he said quietly. Bintu nodded once. "I do. You understand them?" She hesitated, just for a moment. Then she answered honestly, "Yes." Ibrahim studied her face. There was no fear there, no resentment, only control. He said nothing more. But as he walked away, Bintu knew something had changed. That night, alone in her small apartment, she sat on the edge of her bed long after the lights were off. Kareem's voice replayed in her mind, not the words themselves, but the belief behind them, that some people were meant to speak, and some were meant to stay silent. She had lived too much life to accept that lie again. Still, she knew the danger of speaking. She knew what exposure could cost. She had rebuilt herself too carefully to risk everything on a single moment of defiance. And yet, some insults were not meant to be endured. They were meant to be answered. Bintu lay back and stared at the ceiling, her breathing slow, her thoughts steady. The silence around her was no longer protective. It was waiting. Bintu Sanogo had not always lived in silence. There was a time when her voice was her livelihood, when people leaned forward to hear her speak, when rooms fell quiet, not because she was invisible, but because what she said mattered. That life felt distant now, like a dream recalled just before waking. The night before the next board meeting, sleep refused to come. Bintu lay still on her narrow bed, listening to the hum of the city through her window. Somewhere below, a generator coughed to life. A motorcycle passed, a dog barked, then went quiet. Her mind drifted backward. She remembered Dubai in the early mornings, the way the city shimmered before the heat rose. She remembered glass towers and conference rooms colder than this one, rooms where Arabic flowed freely, where she had stood between powerful men and translated not just words but intent. She had been good at it, precise, calm, trusted, until the day everything collapsed. It had started with a contract dispute, nothing unusual, a disagreement between partners, raised voices, long nights. She had translated faithfully, exactly as trained, but when one side lost millions, blame needed a direction, and it fell conveniently on the interpreter. "You misunderstood," they had said. "You failed us. No investigation, no protection, just quiet removal." By the time the truth surfaced months later, her reputation was already destroyed. Opportunities vanished, friends disappeared, pride followed soon after. She returned home to West Africa with nothing but a suitcase and a silence she did not know how to break. That silence had kept her alive. Now, lying awake, she wondered if it was about to betray her. The next morning arrived heavy with humidity and tension. Binto dressed slowly, tying her headscarf with care. She looked at her reflection, at the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, at the calm she had learned to wear like armor. "Just do your work," she whispered to herself. At the office, the atmosphere felt different. People spoke in hushed tones. The upcoming meeting carried unusual weight. A major partnership was at stake, one that could redefine the company's future across borders. Karim Diallo was already there when Bintu arrived to prepare the room. He stood near the window phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapidly in Arabic. His tone was sharp, impatient. "Yes, yes, I know," he said. "They'll follow. They always do." He laughed quietly, ending the call, just as Binto passed behind him with cleaning supplies. He did not look at her. She did not slow down. As executives filed in, the room filled with restrained energy. Some greeted each other warmly. Others avoided eye contact. Everyone knew this meeting mattered. Soliman Touré entered last. As always, the room adjusted itself around him. Chairs straightened, voices lowered, movement slowed. He took his seat without ceremony, his presence firm but unassuming. His eyes swept the room once briefly. They paused for a fraction of a second near the wall where Bintu stood. She felt it not as pressure, but as acknowledgement. The meeting began. Reports were delivered, numbers discussed, risks weighed. Karim spoke often confidently, dominating the conversation. His voice carried authority, and for a time even Suleiman listened without interruption. Then came the turning point. A board member raised concerns about Karim's projections politely, cautiously. He questioned the sustainability of the expansion, suggested caution. Karim smiled. It was the same smile Bintu had learned to fear. He leaned back in his chair and replied in English, at first smooth, dismissive. Then, as if unable to resist, he switched to Arabic. "They fear what they don't understand," he said casually, "and they think silence means ignorance." The words were louder than before, clearer, unmistakable. The room froze. This time, even those who didn't understand the language felt the shift. Tone carried meaning beyond words. Disrespect had weight. Bintu's heart began to pound, not wildly but steadily. Her hands tightened around the mop handle. She felt the old instincts awaken, the trained ear, the translator's precision, the awareness of nuance. She also felt fear, fear of exposure, fear of consequence, fear of reopening wounds she had worked so hard to seal. Karim continued, encouraged by the lack of immediate response. In places like this, he added in Arabic, "Power belongs to those who speak. The rest should remain grateful to listen." A few people shifted uncomfortably. No one laughed. Suleiman remained still. He did not react, and that somehow made the moment heavier. Binto's thoughts raced. She could stay silent, finish her work, walk out unnoticed, keep her fragile peace intact. Or she glanced at Karim, at the casual cruelty in his posture, at the confidence built on the assumption that no one would challenge him. She glanced at Suleiman, at the calm restraint, at the patience that looked almost like permission. And she understood something then. This was not about her pride, it was about erasure. Karim had not just insulted intelligence or authority. He had dismissed the humanity of those he believed beneath him, and if no one spoke, the lie would harden into truth. Binto took a slow breath. Her hand stopped moving. The sound of the mop touching the floor echoed softly in the room. Karim was still speaking when she straightened. No one noticed at first. Then someone did. A head turned, then another. Binto lifted her gaze, not defiantly, not dramatically, but steadily, calmly. The room seemed to contract around her. Kareem's voice faltered as he noticed the shift in attention. He frowned, slightly confused. "What is it?" he asked in English, irritated. Bintu did not answer him yet. She looked at Suleiman, not asking permission, acknowledging presence. Then she spoke, in Arabic, clear, measured, perfectly controlled. "That is not what you said?" She corrected, her voice soft but unmistakable. "You said silence means ignorance, but silence can also mean restraint." Every breath in the room stopped. Kareem stared at her, his face draining of color. Bintu continued, her tone steady, her words precise. "And power does not belong to those who speak the loudest," she said. "It belongs to those who understand what they are saying and who is listening." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed. The maid had spoken, and the room would never be the same again. For several seconds, no one in the room moved. The air itself seemed to freeze, as if the walls were holding their breath. Bintu Sanago stood upright, her hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes steady. She did not raise her voice. She did not apologize. She simply stood there, present in a space that had never acknowledged her before. Kareem Diallo was the first to react. He let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "What did you just say?" he asked in English, his tone sharp, almost offended. "This is a board meeting. You should return to your work." His words were firm, but something underneath them trembled. Bintu did not look away. She did not lower her head. Instead, she replied in Arabic again, slowly, clearly, with the calm authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "I said," she repeated, "that silence does not mean ignorance. It often means dignity." A murmur rippled through the room. Chairs shifted. Someone inhaled sharply. Another executive glanced towards Suleiman Touré, waiting, hoping for him to intervene. Suleiman did nothing. He watched. Kareem's confidence cracked just enough to reveal irritation beneath it. "You're out of line," he said, switching back to English. "You don't belong in this discussion." Bintu nodded once. "That may be true," she answered calmly. "But the language you chose belongs to everyone who understands it." The room fell silent again. Kareem opened his mouth, then closed it. He was suddenly aware of eyes on him, eyes that were no longer impressed. He felt exposed, like a man who had laughed too loudly at his own joke, only to realize no one else found it funny. "You understood all this time?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Yes," Bintu said simply. The word landed like a verdict. Kareem turned sharply toward Suleiman. "Sir, with respect, this is inappropriate. Staff should not interrupt executive meetings." Suleiman finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably in Arabic. "She did not interrupt," he said. She responded. Kareem froze. Several executives straightened in their chairs. A few exchanged looks of surprise, then understanding. The realization moved through the room slowly, like a wave. Suleiman continued, still in Arabic, and she responded accurately. Kareem's face drained of color. He looked from Suleiman to Bintu, then back again, as if hoping the moment might dissolve if he stared hard enough. It didn't. I was unaware," Kareem began, his voice losing its edge. "I didn't know you understood Arabic, sir." Suleiman tilted his head slightly. "You never asked." The simplicity of the statement cut deeper than anger ever could. Suleiman turned his gaze fully to Kareem, now his expression unreadable. "Tell me," he said, "how long have you believed that language could protect disrespect?" Kareem swallowed. "That wasn't my intention." Bintu spoke again. "Not to attack, not to humiliate, but to clarify. Intent does not erase meaning," she said quietly. "Words reveal what we believe when we think no one important is listening." No one challenged her. Suleiman nodded once slowly. "That is true." He looked around the table, meeting each executive's eyes in turn. "This company does not operate on hidden contempt," he said. "If anyone here believes otherwise, now is the time to reconsider their place." The room remained silent, thick with tension. Kareem shifted in his chair. His posture no longer relaxed. "Sir," he said carefully, "I have delivered results. My performance is not under review." Suleiman interrupted calmly. "Your character is." That was the moment Kareem understood. This was no longer a misunderstanding to smooth over. No clever explanation would save him. The power he thought he held through numbers, through confidence, through language, had slipped away the instant he underestimated who was listening. Suleiman turned back to Bintu. "Thank you," he said simply. The words were not loud, they were not dramatic, but they carried weight recognition long overdue. Bintu inclined her head slightly, not in submission, in acknowledgement. For the first time since she had entered the building months ago, she felt seen not as a worker, not as a background presence, but as a human being with a voice. The meeting resumed, but everything had changed. Karim spoke less. When he did, he stayed in English. His tone was restrained, careful. The confidence that once filled the room around him had drained away, leaving behind uncertainty. Others began to speak more freely. Questions were asked without fear. Concerns were raised honestly. The discussion grew sharper, clearer, no longer dominated by one voice. Bintu returned to her place near the wall. She picked up her mop again, but her hands no longer trembled. The floor beneath her feet felt different, as if the room itself had shifted its balance. As the meeting came to an end, executives gathered their papers quietly. Some avoided Karim's eyes. Others glanced at Bintu with something new in their expressions. Respect, curiosity, even regret. Karim stood slowly, straightening his jacket with stiff movements. As he passed Bintu, he hesitated. For a brief moment, it looked as though he might say something. He didn't. He walked out without another word. After the room emptied, Suleiman remained seated. Ibrahim Koni stood beside him, silent as always. Suleiman looked toward Bintu again. "Please," he said, "stay for a moment." Bintu paused, then nodded. As she approached the table, she felt the weight of years pressing behind her and lifting at the same time. She didn't know what would come next. Consequences, questions, perhaps even loss. But she knew one thing with certainty. The silence that had once protected her had finally been broken, and in its place stood something far more dangerous to arrogance. Truth. Bintu Sanogo stopped 2 steps from the table. Up close, the boardroom felt different, less distant, less untouchable. The polished surface reflected her face faintly, like a second self watching from below. She folded her hands calmly, waiting. Years of discipline kept her posture steady, even as her heart beat louder than she wanted to admit. Suleiman Touré studied her for a moment before speaking. "Tell me," he said gently, "how long have you understood what was being said in this room?" Bintu did not rush her answer. She chose truth without drama. "From the first meeting I cleaned," she replied. "From the first sentence spoken in Arabic." Ibrahim Kone shifted slightly beside Suleiman, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in recognition. Suleiman nodded. "And you said nothing?" "Yes." Why? Bintu inhaled slowly. "Because speaking has consequences," she said, "and silence was the only way I knew to survive." The words landed softly, but they carried the weight of years. Suleiman leaned back in his chair. "You could have come to me." "I could have," she agreed, "but I did not know if I would be believed, or punished, or dismissed for being convenient to ignore." There was no accusation in her voice, only clarity. Suleiman's gaze dropped briefly to the table, then lifted again. "You were right to be cautious," he said. "Power does not always welcome truth, especially when it comes from unexpected places." He paused. "But today you chose to speak." Bintu met his eyes. Because today, silence would have meant agreement. The room felt quieter than before, not with tension, but with attention. Ibrahim remained still, listening. Suleiman nodded again. "You corrected Mr. Diallo's words accurately," he said. "More than that, you corrected his assumptions." Bintu said nothing. "Do you still work as an interpreter?" Suleiman asked. "No," she answered. "I stopped after I returned home." "Why? Because my name was damaged," she said, "and because sometimes when a door closes loudly, it is safer to step away than to keep knocking." Suleiman considered that. "Yet your skill remains, yes, and your restraint." "Yes." He held her gaze for another moment, then spoke with quiet resolve. "Thank you for reminding this room of its values." He turned slightly to Ibrahim. "Please note that Ms. Sanogo will not be interrupted or questioned for what she said today." Ibrahim inclined his head. "Of course." Suleiman returned his attention to Bintu. "You may return to your work," he said. "If you wish." Bintu hesitated only briefly. "I will," she said. "Thank you." As she turned to leave, Suleiman added, "Ms. Sanogo." She stopped. "Yes, sir. There are moments when dignity speaks louder than authority," he said. Today was one of them. Bintu nodded once, then walked back toward the wall. Her steps were measured, her shoulders relaxed. The room no longer pressed against her like a weight. It felt lighter. Outside the boardroom, word spread quickly. In hallways and offices, people whispered not in mockery but in disbelief. The maid who spoke Arabic, the director who had been silenced, the CEO who had listened. Karim Diallo did not return to his office. He left the building early, his jaw clenched, his phone buzzing with messages he did not answer. The city outside felt louder than usual, the traffic harsher, the heat heavier. For the first time in a long while, he felt watched and not admired. At home that evening, Karim replayed the moment again and again, the way the room had turned against him, the calm in Suleiman's voice, the precision in Binto's words. He told himself it was a misunderstanding. He told himself it would pass. But something deeper gnawed at him, a realization he could not escape. He'd been exposed, not for a mistake, but for a belief. And beliefs were harder to explain away. The next morning, the office felt different. People greeted Binto by name, not loudly, not dramatically, but deliberately. "Good morning, Ms. Sanogo." "Morning. Hello." Each greeting was small, but together they formed something new, a shift in gravity. She acknowledged them politely, still reserved, still careful. Trust, she knew, was built slowly. In a corner office overlooking the city, Suleiman reviewed reports with Ibrahim. "Karim has requested a private meeting," Ibrahim said. Suleiman did not look up. Later. "Yes, sir. Has the board expressed concerns?" Several, Ibrahim replied, mostly about conduct. Suleiman nodded. "Good." He closed the folder and stood walking toward the window. The city stretched below, full of ambition, hunger, and quiet injustices. He had built his empire navigating these forces, learning when to push and when to wait. Today, waiting had ended. He turned back to Ibrahim. "Arrange a review," he said, "not of performance, of leadership standards." Ibrahim understood immediately, and Ms. Sanogo Suleiman paused. "Observe," he said. "Do not rush. Truth reveals itself fully when given time." By midday, the boardroom filled again, this time with tension, layered beneath politeness. Karim arrived late, his confidence muted, his speech cautious. He avoided looking at the wall. Bintu cleaned quietly, listening, watching. Karim presented numbers with care. He avoided Arabic entirely. When questions came, he answered briefly, defensively. The room did not respond as it once had. The applause of silence was gone. Near the end of the meeting, a junior executive spoke up, hesitant, then steadier. Another followed. The discussion widened. Karim shrank. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be ignored. As the meeting ended, Suleiman rose. "Before we leave," he said calmly, "I want to make one thing clear." The room stilled. "This company measures success not only by results," he continued, "but by respect. Language will not be used to divide, demean, or conceal contempt. Anyone who believes otherwise should reflect carefully." No one spoke. Suleiman's gaze swept the room, then rested briefly on Binto. She met his eyes, steady. In that moment, she understood something she had not allowed herself to believe before. Her silence had protected her, but her voice, used with purpose, had changed the room, and the consequences were only beginning. Karim Diallo did not sleep that night. He lay awake in his dark apartment, staring at the ceiling as the city's distant noise rose and fell like a restless tide. Every time he closed his eyes, the same image returned, the calm, unshaken face of Bintu Sanogo as she spoke, and the colder, sharper calm of Suleiman Toure when he answered her. What unsettled Karim most was not the humiliation. It was the certainty. There had been no shouting, no dramatic dismissal, no public explosion, just clarity, precision, control. And in that quiet exposure, Karim had felt smaller than he ever had in his life. The next morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual. The lobby was nearly empty, the marble floors gleaming under soft lights. He walked past the security desk without greeting anyone, his thoughts already racing ahead. He needed to fix this. Karim had always been good at recovery. Apologies, when necessary, were tools. He had smoothed over mistakes before redirected blame, reframed intentions, turned criticism into misunderstanding. This time, he told himself, would be no different. But as he stepped into the elevator, something felt wrong. The doors slid shut, reflecting his own face back at him. The confidence he usually saw there looked strained, now forced. He adjusted his tie, then stopped. He wasn't sure who he was adjusting it for. When he reached his floor, the change was immediate. Conversations softened as he passed. People looked up and then away, not with fear, with distance, the kind that said, "We saw what happened." Karim clenched his jaw and walked faster. Inside the boardroom, Suleiman was already seated reviewing documents. Ibrahim Kone stood nearby, tablet in hand. The atmosphere was formal, restrained. Karim cleared his throat. "Sir," he said carefully, "may I have a moment?" Soleiman did not look up right away. He finished reading a line, closed the folder, and then met Karim's eyes. "Speak." Karim inhaled. "Yesterday's incident, if it caused offense, that was not my intention. I was speaking casually without thinking. I respect this company and its leadership." Soleiman listened without interruption. His face gave nothing away. When Karim finished, silence followed. Then Soleiman spoke. "You did think," he said calmly. "You thought you were safe." Karim stiffened. "Sir, you thought language would shield you." Soleiman continued. "You thought the people you spoke about could not hear you, and you thought I could not understand you." Karim swallowed. "That was a mistake." "No," Soleiman replied. "That was a belief." The words struck harder than any raised voice. Soleiman leaned back slightly. "Do you know why I did not correct you the first time?" he asked. Karim hesitated. You assumed many things," Soleiman said evenly. "I remained silent because I wanted to see how far you would go when you believed no one important was listening." Karim's hands tightened at his sides. "You went far." Soleiman continued. "Far enough to reveal your values." Karim searched for words. "I can change," he said. "I've delivered results. I've brought growth. Surely that counts for something." Soleiman nodded slowly. "Results matter," he said, "but they do not excuse contempt." He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "We will discuss your future with the board," he added. "For now, return to your duties." Karim left the room feeling colder than when he entered. Down the hall, Bintu Sanogo was quietly organizing cleaning supplies. She moved with her usual care, but she was keenly aware of the eyes that followed her now. People noticed her presence, not as an interruption, as a question. Karim passed her without stopping. For a moment their eyes met. His held resentment, confusion, and something else, fear. Hers held nothing at all. That absence unsettled him more than anger ever could. Later that day, the board convened without Karim present. Soleiman sat at the head of the table, his posture unchanged, his tone measured. He spoke not of numbers, but of culture, not of profit, but of responsibility. "A company reflects the beliefs it tolerates," he said. "When we allow disrespect to hide behind performance, we teach everyone that dignity is optional." Some members nodded, others looked thoughtful. Soleiman continued. "What happened yesterday was not an interruption. It was a correction, and it came from the least protected voice in the room." Silence followed. "Ask yourselves," he said quietly, "what that says about us." By the time the meeting ended, the direction was clear. Karim would not be removed immediately. Not yet, but his authority would be reviewed, his conduct monitored, his influence limited. For the first time in his career, he would be watched instead of admired. As days passed, the change deepened. Karim found himself excluded from informal discussions. Decisions moved around him. People no longer laughed at his comments. When he spoke, the room listened, but without warmth. And Bintu continued her work, but the space around her had shifted. People greeted her, asked her name. Some apologized awkwardly for past indifference. Others simply nodded with new respect. She accepted it all without comment. One afternoon, Ibrahim approached her again. "Mr. Toure would like you to join us tomorrow," he said. "Not as staff." Bintu looked up surprised. In what capacity? Ibrahim smiled faintly. "As someone who understands." That night, Bintu walked home slowly. The streets were busy, the air thick with dust and movement. She thought of her past, the fall, the silence, the years spent shrinking herself to survive. She had not planned this moment. She had not sought recognition. She had simply refused to agree with a lie. At home, she sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker on. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel the need to make herself smaller. Elsewhere, Karim stared at his phone, unread messages piling up. The power he had once wielded through language and presence was slipping from his grasp, and he did not know how to reclaim it. He had mocked without consequence for too long. Now, consequence had learned his name. And in the quiet spaces between meetings, between words, between glances, the company was changing slowly, irreversibly, because one voice had spoken, and others had finally listened. The day Bintu Sanogo was invited back into the boardroom, she did not wear anything new. She wore the same modest uniform she had always worn, clean, neatly pressed, familiar. The difference was not in her clothes, but in the way the room responded to her presence. When she entered, conversations paused, not because she was interrupting, but because she was expected. Soleiman Toure stood at the head of the table reviewing documents with Ibrahim Kone. He looked up as Bintu approached and gestured calmly toward an empty chair along the side. "Please," he said, "sit." Bintu hesitated only a moment before obeying. The chair felt unfamiliar beneath her, the height wrong, the perspective unsettling. She folded her hands in her lap, grounding herself. Across the table, Karim Diallo stiffened. He had not been told she would be there. His eyes flicked from Suleiman to Bintu and back again, confusion tightening into suspicion. He straightened his jacket, trying to recover a sense of authority that no longer came naturally. The meeting began. This time the tone was different. Suleiman did not open with numbers. He opened with a question. "What do we believe leadership means?" he asked calmly. The executives exchanged glances. This was not a typical agenda item. One man cleared his throat. "Accountability," he said cautiously. "Results," another added. "Stability," someone else offered. Suleiman nodded. "All true," he said, "but incomplete." He turned slightly, his gaze resting briefly on Bintu before returning to the room. "Leadership also means understanding the impact of your words when you believe no one important is listening." The silence that followed was heavy. Karim shifted in his seat. "Sir," he said carefully with respect, "are we revisiting what happened last week?" "Yes," Suleiman replied evenly. "We are." Karim swallowed. "I've acknowledged my mistake. I've corrected my behavior." Suleiman inclined his head. "You have corrected your language," he said, "not yet your thinking." Karim's jaw tightened. "I don't understand." Suleiman leaned forward slightly. "Then let us clarify." He turned to Bintu. "Ms. Sanogo, you heard many things in this room before you spoke. Tell us, what did you hear?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Bintu felt every eye on her. Old instincts urged her to deflect, to minimize, to soften. She resisted them. She spoke calmly. "I heard people use language to feel superior," she said. "I heard intelligence measured by accent, not by insight, and I heard silence mistaken for agreement." No one interrupted. Karim's face flushed. "That's an interpretation," he said quickly, "not intent." Bintu turned toward him for the first time. Her voice remained steady. "Intent does not cancel impact," she said, "and patterns reveal belief more clearly than apologies." A murmur rippled through the room. Suleiman raised a hand, slightly restoring quiet. "This is not a trial," he said. "It is a reckoning." He turned back to Karim. "Tell me," he asked, "how many times did you assume you were the smartest person in the room because you spoke a language others did not?" Karim opened his mouth, then closed it. "I don't know," he said, finally. Suleiman nodded. "That answer matters." He stood and walked slowly around the table, speaking as he moved. "When I was younger," he said, "I worked in places where I was underestimated daily. Because of my accent, because of my background, because people believed power had a certain look." He stopped behind Karim's chair. "I learned then that arrogance thrives on unchecked silence." The room felt smaller. Suleiman returned to his seat. "This company will not reward that." He looked around the table. "Effective immediately leadership roles will be evaluated not only on performance but on conduct, on how power is exercised when no one is watching." Karim's breath caught. "Sir." "This includes you," Suleiman said calmly. The words settled like dust after collapse. Karim's shoulders slumped slightly. He tried to speak again, but nothing came. Suleiman turned to Bintu. "Ms. Sanogo," he said, "you have demonstrated clarity, restraint, and courage. Qualities this room needs." Bintu felt a flicker of disbelief. "I only spoke the truth," she said quietly. Suleiman smiled faintly. "That is rarely only." He addressed the room again. "Ms. Sanogo will assist Ibrahim in reviewing cross-cultural communication standards, not because she is extraordinary, but because she has already been doing this work invisibly." No one objected. Karim stared at the table. The meeting ended without applause. As executives filed out, some nodded to Bintu respectfully. Others avoided her eyes, weighed down by recognition. The room emptied until only Suleiman, Ibrahim, and Bintu remained. Suleiman exhaled slowly. "You did not seek this," he said. "And yet here it is." Bintu nodded. "I didn't want to disappear," she said. "That was all." He studied her. "Sometimes," he said, "refusing to disappear is an act of leadership." Outside the boardroom, Karim stood alone by the elevator, staring at his reflection in the doors. He no longer recognized the man looking back. For years he had mistaken confidence for authority and silence for weakness. Now both illusions had shattered. As the elevator descended, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Accountability. The company moved forward, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. Conversation shifted. People listened more carefully. Language became deliberate. And Bintu walked back to her duties with a new weight not of burden, but of presence. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. Respect earned could be tested. Authority granted could be resented. But she also knew this truth had found its footing, and it would not be easily pushed back into silence. The shift inside the company did not happen overnight. It moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a tide changing direction beneath the surface. Meetings still followed schedules. Emails still flooded inboxes. Deadlines still loomed. But something essential had changed the way people listened, and Karim Diallo felt it more than anyone. Where once conversations paused when he spoke, now they continued. Where his suggestions had once been accepted without challenge, now they were questioned, not aggressively, not disrespectfully, just honestly. That honesty unsettled him. He sat through meetings, gripping his pen too tightly, watching junior executives speak with a confidence he had never allowed before. He noticed how often Souleymane Touré asked others for their perspectives, especially those Karim had once dismissed as irrelevant. The hierarchy had not vanished, but its foundation had cracked. One afternoon, Karim was called into a smaller conference room. The blinds were half drawn, letting in slanted lines of sunlight. Ibrahim Kone stood near the window. 2 board members sat quietly at the table. Karim took the chair opposite them, his posture stiff. "This is a leadership review," Ibrahim said calmly. "Not a disciplinary hearing." Karim nodded, though his throat felt dry. "We're here to discuss patterns," one board member added, "not just outcomes." Karim leaned forward. "My outcomes are strong," he said quickly. "My division exceeded projections. I've brought measurable growth." "No one disputes that," Ibrahim replied, "but leadership is not measured only in numbers." Karim exhaled sharply. "Then, what am I being punished for?" For a moment of poor judgment, the other board member shook his head. For repeated judgment, silence followed. Karim looked from face to face, searching for sympathy. He found none, only professionalism, distance. "We want to know," Ibrahim continued, "whether you understand why what happened matters." Karim opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. The answer that would have come easily weeks ago, defensive, polished, felt hollow now. "I believed intelligence made me superior," he said finally, his voice low. "I believed silence meant agreement. That belief," the board member said gently, "creates damage that numbers can't repair." The review ended without a verdict. No firing, no dramatic fall, just a reduction in authority, a restructuring of influence, a message delivered without cruelty but with precision. Karim left the room feeling smaller, not because he had been humiliated, but because he had been seen clearly for the first time. Elsewhere in the building, Bintou Sanogo sat with Ibrahim in a modest office, a stack of documents spread between them. Policies, training outlines, cultural communication guidelines. "This isn't about perfection," Ibrahim said. "It's about awareness." Bintou nodded. "People fear what exposes them," she said. "Language does that. It reveals what we hide." Ibrahim smiled faintly. "That's why Mr. Touré trusts you." The word trust landed gently but firmly. Bintou absorbed it quietly. She had lived long enough to know trust was not a gift. It was a responsibility. As the weeks passed, she found herself speaking more, not loudly, not often, but when it mattered. She facilitated sessions. She listened to concerns. She translated not just words, but tensions. Some welcomed the change. Others resisted. A few resented her. She felt it in glances that lingered too long, in smiles that did not reach the eyes, in conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She expected it. What surprised her was how little it shook her. One evening, as she packed up her materials, Souleymane knocked lightly on the open door. "May I?" he asked. "Of course," she replied, standing. He waved her back to her seat. "Please." He entered, closing the door behind him. For a moment he said nothing. He looked around the room. Plain furniture, organized stacks, quiet order. "This space suits you," he said. Bintou smiled slightly. "It's enough." Souleymane nodded. "That's something we have in common." He paused. "I want to be clear." He continued. "What happened did not begin or end with Karim. I know," she said. "This company will face resistance as it changes," he said, "from people who benefited from silence." Bintou met his gaze. "Silence doesn't disappear," she said. "It just moves. You have to keep listening." Suleiman's expression softened. Exactly. He hesitated, then added, "You didn't have to stay." "I chose to," she replied. "Leaving would have been easier, and easy things rarely change anything." He smiled this time genuinely. Meanwhile, Karim struggled. He found himself isolated not by punishment but by self-awareness. Every comment he made now passed through a filter he had never used before. Every joke felt dangerous. Every silence suspicious. He watched Bintu from a distance, how people sought her input, how Suleiman acknowledged her presence without spectacle. It gnawed at him, not because she had power, but because she had integrity. One afternoon, Karim found himself standing near the supply room where he had once passed her without seeing her at all. He hesitated, then knocked lightly on the open door. Bintu looked up, surprised. "Yes, I wanted to say." He stopped. The words tangled in his mouth. Apologies had always come easily before. Now they felt heavy. "I was wrong," he said finally, "not just in what I said, in how I saw people." Bintu studied him for a long moment. She did not rush to forgive. She did not reject him either. "Understanding is a beginning," she said, "not a conclusion." He nodded, swallowing. "I know." As he walked away, Karim felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not shame, not anger, but the slow ache of growth. Change, he realized, was not loud. It was uncomfortable. The company continued forward, reshaped not by policy alone, but by awareness. Meetings grew more inclusive. Language became intentional. Power softened without weakening. And in the quiet center of it all stood a woman who had once cleaned floors unnoticed. Now she cleaned assumptions, and the work had only just begun. Karim Diallo's apology did not change everything. It changed nothing quickly. And that perhaps was the hardest part. For years, his rise had followed a simple pattern mistake explanation recovery. This time, there was no clean reset, no applause for humility, no immediate restoration of status. There was only the slow, unfamiliar work of sitting with what he had done and who he had been while doing it. He returned to his office each morning to the same desk, the same view, the same responsibilities. But the atmosphere had altered. Invitations arrived later. Decisions reached him after they were already shaped. When he spoke in meetings, people listened, but without deference. He had become ordinary. At first, the ordinariness felt like punishment. He noticed how others now spoke with ease, how junior staff raised concerns without hesitation, how conversations unfolded without waiting for his approval. He felt replaced not by another authority figure, but by a culture that no longer centered him. And for the first time, Karim understood what it meant to be background. Across the building, Bintu Sanogo's days grew fuller. Her schedule expanded beyond cleaning duties into structured meetings, quiet consultations, and thoughtful planning sessions. She worked closely with Ibrahim, reviewing communication policies and facilitating discussions across departments. She listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, people leaned in. Not because she demanded attention, because she earned trust. Yet the visibility came with a cost. Some colleagues tested her boundaries, questioned her credentials indirectly, challenged her suggestions politely but persistently. Others watched her closely, waiting for missteps. Bintu recognized the pattern. Respect offered too quickly often carried conditions. She remained steady. One afternoon, during a training session on cross-cultural communication, a senior manager raised his hand. With respect, he said, "Aren't we overreacting?" One incident doesn't define an entire system. The room grew quiet. Bintu nodded thoughtfully. "You're right," she said. "One incident doesn't define a system." She paused. "But patterns do?" The manager frowned slightly. "And what pattern are we addressing? The pattern of speaking differently when you believe certain people don't count," she replied calmly. "The pattern of assuming silence equals agreement. The pattern of mistaking access for authority." No one argued. After the session, Suleiman watched from the doorway as people lingered, discussing, not debating, not dismissing, but considering. He recognized the signs of genuine change, discomfort without defensiveness, questions without hostility. That evening, he called Karim into his office. Karim entered cautiously, his posture restrained. "You wanted to see me, sir?" "Yes," Suleiman said. "Sit." Karim did. Suleiman folded his hands. "I want to speak plainly," he said. "Your position is under review, not because you failed, but because you are changing." Karim stiffened. "Is that a problem? It depends." Soleiman replied. Change can deepen leadership or expose its absence. Karim met his gaze. I don't want to lose everything I've built, Soleiman nodded. Then you must decide what you're building for. Silence stretched between them. You were effective, Soleiman continued, but effectiveness without respect corrodes from the inside. I will not lead a company that mistakes fear for loyalty. Karim swallowed. What do you expect of me? Listen, Soleiman said simply, and when you speak, speak with the awareness that everyone matters even when you think they don't. Karim nodded slowly. I'm trying. I know, Soleiman said. Trying is visible. As Karim left, he felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, not dread, but direction. The next weeks tested him. In meetings, he held back when he once would have dominated. When he disagreed, he explained rather than dismissed. When he felt irritation rise, he paused sometimes painfully before responding. Not everyone noticed, but some did, and that mattered. Meanwhile, Bintu faced her own reckoning. One morning, she arrived to find a note on her desk, anonymous, neatly folded. You don't belong here. Don't forget where you came from. The words were simple. The intent was not. She stared at the paper for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it in her bag. She did not report it. She did not confront anyone. She chose a different response. That afternoon, during a company-wide forum, she shared a story not of the incident, but of her past, of losing everything, of returning home unseen, of choosing silence as survival. And then she said, her voice steady, I learned that silence can protect you, but it can also erase you. The room was still. I'm not here to replace anyone, she continued. I'm here to remind us that dignity isn't tied to position. It's tied to how we treat people when we think no one important is listening. When she finished, no one clapped. They didn't need to. Afterward, Ibrahim found her in the hallway. Are you okay? He asked quietly. Yes, she said. I expected resistance. He nodded. You handled it with grace. She smiled faintly. Grace is a form of endurance. In the days that followed, the anonymous note stopped. Conversations shifted. People corrected themselves not because they were told to, but because they had learned to notice. One evening, as the office emptied, Karim found Bintu near the elevator. I heard your talk, he said. She nodded. Thank you for listening. He hesitated. I'm beginning to understand what you meant about patterns. She studied him. Understanding is progress, she said. What you do with it is choice. He nodded, thoughtful. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Bintu felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and resolve. Change was not clean. It was layered, uneven, often lonely, but it was happening. And in a company once defined by what went unchallenged, a new standard was taking root, one conversation at a time. Change Bintu. Sonogo learned had a sound. It was not loud. It did not announce itself with applause or slogans. It sounded like pauses, small, deliberate pauses before words were spoken. It sounded like questions asked instead of assumptions made. It sounded like correction without humiliation. Inside the company, that sound grew clearer with each passing week. Meetings no longer began with the loudest voice filling the room. They began with listening. Soleiman Touré often opened discussions by asking those who spoke least to speak first. Junior analysts found their ideas taken seriously. Support staff were acknowledged by name. It was subtle, but it was real. Bintu moved through this evolving space with careful awareness. Her role had expanded officially now. She no longer cleaned floors full-time. Her days were divided between advisory work and observation, helping departments understand how language shaped power, how silence shaped culture. Yet she never forgot where she had started. She still greeted cleaners and security guards by name, still helped tidy a room when needed, still carried herself without entitlement. The difference was that now people noticed and followed. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some executives resisted quietly. They complied publicly but clung privately to old hierarchies. They smiled politely at Bintu in meetings, then questioned her authority behind closed doors. She expected this. Resistance, she knew, was often a sign that something essential had been touched. One afternoon during a leadership workshop, a senior director challenged her openly. With all due respect, he said, arms crossed, aren't we placing too much weight on feelings? Business is about performance, not sensitivity. The room grew still. Bintu met his gaze calmly. Performance and sensitivity are not opposites, she said. You cannot sustain excellence in a culture that erodes dignity. The director frowned. We didn't erode anything. People were free to speak, she nodded. Free for whom? That question lingered in the air. Soleiman, seated near the back, did not intervene. He watched not to protect Binto, but to see whether the room had learned to listen. It had. Another executive spoke up. "She's right," he said. "We all heard things before. We just didn't think they mattered." The director exhaled slowly, uncrossing his arms. The conversation shifted. After the session, Suleiman approached Bintu as others filtered out. "You let the room answer itself," he observed. Bintu smiled slightly. "People listen better when they hear themselves thinking." Suleiman nodded. "That's leadership." Elsewhere in the building, Karim Diallo was experiencing change from a different angle. His responsibilities had narrowed, his influence had softened. But in the absence of unchecked authority, something unexpected emerged: clarity. For the first time in his career, Karim had to persuade rather than command. He had to explain his reasoning, not assume agreement. At first, the process frustrated him. He felt slowed, constrained. Then gradually he noticed something else. Ideas improved. Discussions deepened. People challenged him not out of defiance but engagement. One afternoon during a project review, a junior colleague questioned his approach. Karim's instinct flared defensiveness, rising fast. He paused. "Tell me more," he said instead. The room shifted. The colleague spoke, hesitant at first, then steadier. The suggestion was thoughtful, not perfect, but valuable. Karim nodded slowly. "That's worth considering," he said. The words tasted unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. After the meeting, he sat alone, staring at his notes. He realized something uncomfortable. For years, he had mistaken obedience for competence, and he had been wrong. The realization stung, but it also freed him. That evening, Karim stayed late reviewing past emails and notes. He saw patterns he had once ignored: dismissive comments, casual jokes, moments of unnecessary dominance. He did not excuse them. He did not erase them. He acknowledged them. Across town, Binto returned home exhausted but grounded. She cooked a simple meal, then sat by the window watching the city settle into night. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Thank you for what you said today. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear it." She stared at the screen, then typed a brief reply. "You're welcome." Listening changes more than speaking. She set the phone down, her chest tight, not with fear but with responsibility. She knew visibility invited scrutiny, that every word she spoke now carried weight beyond herself. She could no longer retreat into anonymity. But she also knew this moment mattered not just for her, but for others who had learned to stay silent to survive. The next board meeting marked another shift. Soleiman announced a new initiative: formal mentorship across departments, pairing senior leaders with staff from different backgrounds and roles. "This is not about charity," he said. "It's about perspective." He paused. Leadership that cannot see itself clearly cannot lead others. Some nodded enthusiastically. Others looked uneasy. Karim listened intently. Later, he found himself assigned as a mentor to someone he would once have overlooked entirely, a facilities coordinator with 10 years of experience and no formal title. At first, the conversation was awkward. Then it wasn't. The coordinator spoke honestly about barriers, about moments of invisibility, about navigating respect without authority. Karim listened, truly listened for the first time. He left the meeting unsettled and grateful. Days turned into weeks. The company did not become perfect. Mistakes were made. Old habits resurfaced. Progress stalled, then resumed, but the direction was clear. Dignity was no longer optional. One afternoon, Bintu stood in the boardroom alone after a meeting, gazing at the long table she had once cleaned in silence. She ran her hand lightly along its surface, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. She thought of the woman she had been, the one who had believed survival required disappearance. She thought of the woman she was becoming, one who understood that presence used wisely could reshape a room. Soleiman entered quietly behind her. "You've changed this place," he said. She shook her head. "I didn't," she replied. "It changed because people chose to listen." He smiled. "Sometimes listening needs a beginning." Bintu turned toward him, her expression steady. "And sometimes," she said, "it needs courage." Outside, the city continued its restless motion, unaware of the quiet revolution unfolding inside glass walls and meeting rooms. But inside, something fundamental had shifted, and it was no longer possible to go back. The weeks that followed felt quieter on the surface, but beneath that calm, something deep was settling into place. Binto Sonogo began to notice it in the smallest moments, in the way meetings opened with a pause instead of a declaration, in the way people checked themselves mid-sentence and chose better words, in the way silence once used to dominate was now used to listen. Yet healing, she knew, was never linear. One morning, as she prepared materials for a leadership session, she received an email from an external partner, short, formal, and dismissive. The tone was familiar, the language subtle but loaded. It questioned her authority without naming it, praised the initiative while requesting a more senior representative to finalize decisions. Bintu read it twice. The old instinct stirred, the one that urged retreat, accommodation, and visibility. She felt it clearly now, not as fear, but as memory. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and typed a measured response. I will be leading this discussion. If that is not acceptable, please let us know so we can reconsider the partnership. She sent it without apology. An hour later, the reply arrived. An apology. A clarification. An agreement to proceed. Bintu leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. It wasn't victory she felt. It was alignment. Across the building, Karim Diallo was facing a reckoning of his own. His mentorship sessions had become mirrors, reflecting parts of himself he had never examined. Listening to someone describe years of being overlooked, he recognized echoes of his own behavior, not as a villain, not as a monster, but as a man who had benefited from a system without questioning it. One afternoon, after a particularly honest conversation, Karim sat alone in his office long after everyone else had left. He stared at a photo on his desk himself at a younger age, standing proudly beside an award banner. He remembered how invincible he had felt that day, how certain that he deserved everything he had earned. Now, certainty felt different. It felt heavier. That evening, Karim requested a meeting with Bintu, not through Ibrahim, not through hierarchy, directly. She agreed. They met in a small conference room, neutral ground. Karim arrived first, standing when she entered, unsure whether to sit or speak. Bintu gestured calmly toward the chairs. Please, she said. They sat. I want to be clear. Karim began. I didn't ask for this meeting to justify myself. She nodded. Then speak. He swallowed. I'm trying to understand how someone like me changes without pretending to be someone else. Bintu considered him. Change doesn't ask you to pretend, she said. It asks you to notice. Notice what? When you speak to impress, she replied. When you listen only to respond. When you assume your comfort matters more than someone else's dignity. Karim nodded slowly. I'm noticing how uncomfortable that feels. That's normal, she said. Comfort often protects habits. He hesitated. Do you believe people like me can learn? Bintu held his gaze. I believe people who are willing to stay uncomfortable can. The conversation ended without resolution, but something shifted between them. Not trust, not forgiveness, but understanding. Elsewhere, Souleymane Touré watched the changes with careful restraint. He didn't interfere unnecessarily. He didn't announce progress. He understood that lasting change didn't require a spotlight, it required consistency. One evening, he invited Bintu to join him for a walk through the building after hours. The halls were quiet, the lights dimmed, their footsteps echoed softly. When I first heard you speak, Souleymane said, I recognized something familiar. What Bintu asked. Restraint, he replied. The kind that comes from knowing when not to speak, she smiled faintly. And when to. Yes, he said, that's rarer. They stopped near the boardroom. The long table stood empty now, chairs neatly aligned. The space looked almost ordinary without the weight of power pressing down on it. Souleymane gestured toward it. This room has seen decisions that changed lives, he said. Some for the better, some not. Bintu nodded. Rooms remember, she said, even when people forget. He turned to her. You've helped this place remember differently. She shook her head gently. People chose to listen because you spoke. Silence settled between them, not awkward, not heavy, comfortable. That night, Bintu returned home and unpacked a box she had carried unopened for years. Inside were old documents, notes, certifications from her time as an interpreter, evidence of a life she had once believed was over. She laid them out carefully on the table. For the first time, she didn't feel pain looking at them. She felt continuity. The past was not a failure. It was preparation. Days later, the company hosted a forum open to all staff. No speeches, no formal agenda, just conversation. People spoke about moments they had stayed silent, about times they had spoken and regretted it, about learning to listen. One cleaner shared her story. One security guard shared his. One manager apologized publicly, not to be praised but to be honest. Bintu listened, her chest tight with emotion. This was the sound of healing. Karim spoke too, briefly, without defense. "I'm learning," he said, "and I'm grateful I wasn't removed before I had the chance." No one clapped. They didn't need to. As the forum ended, people lingered, talking quietly, thoughtfully. The building felt warmer, less rigid, less divided. Bintu stood near the exit, watching. She thought of the woman she had been when she first entered this place. Head down, voice, buried presence, minimized. She thought of the woman she was now, still careful, still quiet, but no longer invisible. Change, she realized, was not about becoming louder. It was about becoming whole. And wholeness, once claimed, was impossible to hide. The transformation did not announce itself with celebration. It settled into routine. By the time the new quarter began, the company's rhythm had changed in ways that were easy to overlook if one wasn't paying attention. Calendars filled, targets were set, reports were delivered. But beneath the familiar structure, a quieter discipline had taken hold, one that asked people to slow down before speaking and to listen before deciding. Bintu Sanogo felt that discipline most clearly in how often she was no longer the only one to name it. During meetings, she noticed executives correcting themselves without prompting. A phrase paused, rephrased, a joke withheld, a question redirected toward someone who hadn't spoken yet. These moments were small, unremarkable to an outsider, but to Bintu, they were evidence of something lasting. Culture had begun to carry itself. Her responsibilities continued to expand, though not in title-heavy ways. She helped shape onboarding programs, ensuring that new hires understood not just expectations, but values. She consulted quietly when conflicts arose, not to judge, but to translate misunderstandings before they hardened into resentment. Still, she insisted on boundaries. "I don't want to be everywhere," she told Ibrahim one afternoon as they reviewed schedules. "If people rely on me to correct them, they won't learn to notice themselves." Ibrahim nodded. "That's wise. It's necessary," she said. "Change must outgrow its teachers." That same week, Souleymane Touré made a decision he had been considering for some time. He announced a company-wide review, not of profits, not of expansion, but of leadership, succession, and development. The message was simple. Authority would no longer be inherited by volume or tenure alone. It would be cultivated through accountability. Some welcomed the announcement, others were uneasy. Karim Diallo read the memo twice, his expression unreadable. He had changed, there was no denying that. But change he was learning did not guarantee comfort. It asked for humility again and again. Later that day, he requested another meeting with Souleymane. This time there was no tension. They sat across from each other in quiet understanding. "I know I may not be the same leader I was before," Karim said carefully. "I don't know yet if that's a loss or an improvement." Souleymane studied him. "What do you think?" Karim considered the question. "I think I'm less impressive," he said, "and more useful." Souleymane smiled faintly. "Then you're on the right path." Karim nodded. "I want to stay. Not because I deserve to, but because I'm learning." Learning, Souleymane said, is a commitment, not a defense. "I understand." The meeting ended without promises. None were needed. Across the city, Bintu stood in a different room altogether. A community hall where the company had partnered with local organizations to host a skills workshop. The attendees were not executives. They were students, tradespeople, job seekers, parents. Bintu spoke simply, without slides or prepared remarks. "Language shapes opportunity," she said. "But opportunity also shapes language. How you speak to others determines what doors you believe exist." A young woman raised her hand. "What if no one listens?" Bintu smiled gently. "Then choose your moment carefully, and speak when silence would cost you more than words." After the session, several people approached her, not for favors, not for connections, but for advice. She listened patiently, offering perspective without promise. She knew better than to confuse inspiration with rescue. That evening, as she returned home, she found an envelope waiting at her door. Inside was a handwritten note from Mama Aissata Touré. "I have heard about you," it read. "I would like to meet the woman who reminded my son who he is." Bintu stared at the words for a long moment, emotion tightening her chest. She agreed to the meeting. They met on a quiet afternoon at Mama Aissata's modest home. The older woman greeted Bintu warmly, studying her with eyes sharpened by years of wisdom. "You speak with care," Mama Aissata said after tea was poured. "It tells me you've known loss." Bintu nodded. And survival. Mama Aysata smiled. Those who survive quietly often understand the world most clearly. They spoke for hours about family, about dignity, about the dangers of forgetting one's roots. When Bintu rose to leave, Mama Aysata held her hand. Whatever you become, she said, do not let them rush you into it. Bintu carried those words with her. Back at the office, preparations were underway for the annual leadership address. It was usually a polished affair, speeches, crafted achievements, highlighted applause, measured. This year, Soleiman changed the format. He spoke briefly. We've learned something important, he told the room. Strength without awareness becomes fragile. Power without listening becomes noise. He paused. This year, we measure progress differently. Then he invited voices from across the company to speak, one from security, one from operations, one from junior staff. And finally, Bintu. She stood at the podium, heart steady, gaze calm. I did not come here to change this company, she said. I came to survive. A ripple of quiet acknowledgement moved through the room. But survival teaches you something, she continued. It teaches you what matters when nothing else is guaranteed. She spoke of silence not as weakness, but as preparation. Of words not as weapons, but as bridges. When she finished, there was no thunderous applause. There was something better, stillness. As the year drew toward its close, the company felt different to everyone who moved through it. Not softer, not weaker, clearer. Bintu returned once more to the boardroom after hours, standing alone by the table that had once been her boundary. She placed her hand on the surface and smiled. Not because everything was resolved, but because it was honest. Change, she knew, was not an event. It was a practice. And this place had begun to practice well. On the morning everything quietly came full circle, Bintu Sanogo arrived early. The building was still half asleep. Lights dimmed hallways, echoing softly with the distant hum of air conditioning. She paused at the entrance of the boardroom, not out of hesitation, but out of memory. The room no longer carried the same weight it once had. Power had not vanished from it, but it had softened, learned to breathe. She stepped inside. The long table was set for a final meeting of the year. Chairs aligned, papers neatly stacked, a glass of water placed at each seat. Bintu moved around the room with the same care she always had, straightening a chair here, aligning a folder there. Not because it was expected, but because it mattered to her. She believed in finishing things well. As the sun rose, executives began to arrive. Greetings were exchanged without performance. Laughter was quiet, genuine. The tension that once lived in the corners of the room had loosened its grip. Karim Diallo entered last. He paused at the doorway when he saw Bintu. Not startled, not ashamed, simply attentive. Good morning, he said. Good morning, she replied. They shared a brief nod, nothing ceremonial, nothing heavy. Just acknowledgement. Soleiman Tour arrived moments later. As always, the room adjusted around him, not out of fear, but respect. He took his seat, surveyed the table, then glanced toward Bintu. Thank you, he said quietly. She inclined her head. The meeting began. This time there was no presentation, no agenda filled with numbers and projections. Soleiman spoke first, his voice calm and unhurried. This is our last meeting of the year, he said. Before we close it, I want us to reflect not on what we achieved, but on what we changed. Silence followed, not the old silence of avoidance, but the new one of consideration. Soleiman continued. We changed how we listen, how we speak, how we treat those we once thought were not part of the conversation. He paused. That matters. He turned to Karim. Mr. Diallo, he said, you asked to speak. Karim straightened slightly. He took a breath. I want to acknowledge something, he began. A year ago, I believed leadership meant being the loudest voice in the room. I believed intelligence was something to display, not to share. He glanced briefly at Bintu, then back to the table. I was wrong, he said, and I'm grateful I was corrected before that belief cost this company more than it already had. No one interrupted. I don't know what my future here will look like, Karim continued. But I know I'm a better leader today than I was then, not because I'm more confident, but because I'm more aware. He sat back. The room remained quiet, not out of discomfort, but respect. Soleiman nodded. Thank you, he said. He turned then to Bintu. Sanogo, he said, before we conclude, would you like to say anything? Bintu hesitated, not from fear, but from care. She rose slowly, standing at the side of the table rather than at its head. I will be brief, she said. She looked around the room at faces that once overlooked her, at eyes that now met hers without doubt. I didn't speak when it was safe, she said. I spoke when it was necessary. A few heads nodded. Silence can protect you, she continued, but it can also erase you. The difference lies in why you choose it. She paused. This year we learned that dignity doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly when we decide who matters. She inclined her head and sat down. The meeting ended without ceremony. People gathered their things, slowly lingering in conversation. Some approached Bintu not to praise her but to thank her. Others simply nodded, carrying the weight of what had been learned into the next year. As the room emptied, Bintu remained behind, returning chairs to their places, aligning the table one last time. Soleiman watched her from the doorway. "You don't have to do that anymore," he said gently. She smiled. "I know." He stepped closer. "Will you stay?" She considered the question not as an offer, but as an invitation, as she said. "On my terms," he nodded, "as it should be." Later that evening, after the building had gone quiet again, Bintu stood alone by the window watching the city lights come alive. She thought of the long road that had brought her here, the losses, the silence, the moment she chose to speak. She did not feel triumphant. She felt complete. Change had not made her louder. It had made her whole. And wholeness, she knew, was the truest kind of authority. In life, power often speaks loudly, but truth rarely does. This story reminds us that dignity does not always wear a title, and intelligence does not always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who understand the room better than anyone else. Bintu's journey teaches us that silence is not weakness. It can be survival. It can be wisdom. But there comes a moment when silence begins to erase who we are, and in that moment speaking becomes an act of courage, not to humiliate, not to seek revenge, but to restore balance. Kareem's transformation shows another truth: change is possible, but it is uncomfortable. Real growth does not come from being praised, it comes from being confronted with who we truly are. Accountability is not punishment, it is an invitation to become better. And Soleiman's leadership reminds us that true power listens, it observes, it waits. And when it finally speaks, it creates space for others to rise, not by force, but by fairness. In a world where many people are told to stay quiet, stay small, and stay invisible, this story asks an important question. What would change if we truly listened to those we usually ignore? If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on your own life, share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and human value, stories that remind us who we are, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. More stories are waiting.